Mr. Arup is a one-off. You can't find another man like it.
Philosopher first, and an engineer second.
He led by philosophizing, by example.
He became the thinking architect's engineer.
You could be forgiven for thinking that he lived on another planet almost, but he didn't. He managed to live in several planets at once.
He is recognised as being the engineer of the 20th century.
That little book of doodles and doggerel, I think, say more about Arup than many of the other things written about him. One can see very much the kind of man he was, his ideas, his ideals, his worries, his cares. He who's seeking wisdom's core is doomed to seek forevermore. I mean, that's wonderful, isn't it? To see ourselves as others see us, it hardly helps us in our task. It does not from compulsion free us to seek out what's behind the mask.
He was looking like a prince, like a marquise, you know, kind of slightly eccentric.
You know, as a young child, I almost thought he was, I wished he wouldn't be quite so eccentric. You know how children want to fit in anything. And, you know, the fact that, you know, well, nowadays it's different, but, you know, had a strange name and, you know, my parents spoke, you know, funny accents and so on and so forth. And then on top of that, he was quite eccentric.
Elegant in physically and mentally. And this was making the legend, you know, this man from the north. And this legend was flying above us.
We'd move rather slowly in a very elegant way, never rush. Always had time for you.
He always would introduce himself to you. He would come and say, "I'm Arup." Who else would it be? We knew he was in the building because he smoked cigars. And he could smell the cigar from the time he came in the door.
If you have a child in you longing to get out, then perhaps you understand.
Danish by origin, born in Newcastle. It was an accident of birth that he was born in England. We should be proud of that.
Came from a smart background. He went to good schools, sort of equivalent of a public school, British public school in Denmark. He was beautifully mannered, well dressed.
He read philosophy at university, so it was a mixture of both philosophy and science. Powerful way.
I think his philosophical studies he was very fastidious about understanding things. The truth. He often talked about truth. He had a funny way of pronouncing it. He said truth. As I've said, it could well be, for where is the philosophy which can decide what's good, what's bad? There's nothing like it to be had. If that's the fact, what should I do?
The main thing was to find out what you really had to do here in this planet. I mean, why are you here, what's the whole thing about, and so on. I thought that one could first find out what one ought to do in philosophy, what was right and wrong, and what was true, and all that sort of thing, and then one can organize one's life in accordance with that. I mean, that is a quite natural process. The transition from studying philosophy and then taking up engineering, that's quite a different matter. That's an irrational thing. That's because, to put it bluntly, I got fed up with philosophy.
And I think that was one of the big problems he had with philosophy, in a way, is that philosophy isn't absolute, and that was a bit of a trouble. Engineering was much more absolute, and that probably, shifted him in one direction and away from another.
He graduated in 1922, and it's a great moment because Corbusier is just about to publish his famous book, Vers une architecture, or Towards a New Architecture, as it was translated in English a few years later. Arup, as a young man, freshly graduated, this huge knowledge already of reinforced concrete and a desire to do something new. He reads this book, and it's like a religious text almost. And there he was, just at the right time to springboard into a world of engineering.
He was obviously bright. He wrote a number of papers on jetties and marine structures, which were his main activity when he first graduated.
And I think the marine structures now, which are piled structures rather than heavily buttressed structures, that all came about through Ove Arup's work. And Ove had a history. He had a history that was worth reading and meaningful to us all. And so we had a sort of reverence for him.
In the 1930s, Arup worked with Bertold Lubetkin and his practice Tekton in London, with a team who were seen as, they were young Turks, and they were brilliant. There was one thing they didn't know how to do. Remember, they're very young, very energetic, and brilliant minds. They could draw, they could dream. They did not have the engineering sense, the skills. And there was this extraordinary, strange, enormously tall, odd fellow called Ove Arup, who basically teamed up with them, performed a lovely duet with these modern young architects. And hand in hand, they waltzed through the 1930s, late 30s, creating buildings that were truly inspirational, different, and sometimes very beautiful. He was a kind of artist. He loved the world of arts and he loved the world of contemporary culture. He was both bohemian and very rational and practical at the same time.
He himself, I think, felt more comfortable in the company of artists and architects and engineers.
This is a drawing that I did for the first portrait I did in 1973, and the first session was to get to know him. For me, the eyes are very, very important in a portrait. I mean, you go into the person through the eyes. And the actual pose of the bridged hands, which I think is quite characteristic of him. And he always put these chopsticks in his pocket. I never quite knew why.
He always had a couple of rather superior chopsticks put into his pocket, quite long, lacquered black, and he used them. And I objected to the way he used them, because if I had some really nice prawns on my plate, he'd lean over with his chopsticks and take the best one. I get quite annoyed with that, but you couldn't really get annoyed with them.
Well, I didn't realise for a long time that they weren't ordinary chopsticks. They were made in Japan, not China, and they were tapered to a point, and they were longer than ordinary chopsticks. He had them made, he would do, of course, specially.
If you're old, you have to be cunning if you want to stay in the running.
The firm, as we recognise it now, starting in 1946, he was already well into his career. He was in his 50s at the time when he started the firm.
He was very good at attracting the right people at the time when he started and then allowing them space to develop, you know, in their own right.
But his ability to pick the people, the right people, who could have this friendly first-name approach, but still got all the respect that they were entitled to.
I realized from the beginning that it is very important to get the right people, collaborators to work. It's the most important. And I for a long time, not anymore, I'm afraid, but for a long time, I took on everybody myself. I mean, I interviewed them and spoke to them, and you get an impression from whether you like the man or not.
It was an extraordinary interview. Ooh, he said, "What shall I ask you?" So I said, "Well, you could ask me if I'm qualified." And are you? I said, "Yes, I'm a chartered structural engineer." Oh, well, yes. He suddenly looked up and he said, "Are you intelligent?" And I said, "Well," he said, "Oh, that's a silly question, isn't it?" And I said, "Well, it's not one I can answer." And then he said, "Well," he said, "I think you've got a nice sort of face and will fit in."
His rather unconventional way of interviewing people for jobs would probably quite quickly sort them out, because if they were completely flummoxed or by the whole process, they probably weren't suitable, and that might reveal itself.
It was not only a question of whether he was a good engineer or something like that. It was just as much a question whether he was a sort of person you could work with or would fit in with other people, so keep the right atmosphere in the place.
The first days when the firm was smaller, we used to have summer picnic days and go out on the firm used to hire barges, and Ove would go out there with his piano accordion and play music all the time.
Unless the atmosphere is right and friendly, I mean, very silly, the whole thing, isn't it? I mean, it's one of the sort of quite obvious, essential ingredients of having a reasonably happy life, isn't it?
There's a picture of Ove playing his accordion at one of the outings to the Thames.
He used to sit in a punt and be punted and play tunes. He was completely contented. He wasn't very good, but nobody can play. In those days, there was a big division between architects and engineers. Real engineers, didn't work for architects. Not during the war or immediately after it.
The Victoria Street group, which is what I referred to, were people that had been doing engineering for a very long time and seemed to be stuck in a rut. Overhap changed all that, and as a result, the whole sort of ethos and practice of structural engineering, particularly structural engineering, was revolutionised, and it became a very thinking and caring profession to be involved in.
I know that this business of getting various people to pull together and integrating, the designs, or integrating, getting people to act harmonious together for that, is a very difficult one, and it is psychological and political and all sorts of things.
Arup himself was so keen on what he called total building, not thinking of just the engineer making a building conceived by an architect to stay up.
For him, engineering and anything to do with involvement of the built environment had a moral overtone running right through it. Design itself had moral imperatives, both obviously professionally and technically, but beyond that.
And if you can build something which is good and which is marvelous and which is a monument for all that, you're doing more than just building this thing. It's a spiritual thing. It's a spiritual thing to have a sort of example of perfection or of something grand and big, which will be classified as one of the great buildings in the world.
I think a turning point came when he met Jon Utzon. The architect for Sydney Opera House. Because Utzon was Danish, he was culturally on the same wavelength. He was a brilliant designer and extraordinary personality, tall, good-looking, and Ove was quite bowled over with him.
I think he's a very unusual architect. I mean, and he's very gifted, he's very good sense of space. And he sort of has got a very good sense of all the architectural, what should I say, the bricks with which you make architecture, I mean, color and form.
The interesting thing, which I suppose we'll never know, is the extent to which Ove realised the shells were unbuildable as shells when he offered to do the job.
He committed the construction before they actually knew the cost, before the designs of the interiors or anything like that had been done, before any of the work had been done that showed that what was going to be built was possible.
Nothing like that had been done, and so that the mental pressure was actually enormous.
The costs had kept going up and it took so long, to the extent that there was a time when one almost was embarrassed to own up being involved in it.
Utzon was given a series of deadlines for the production of his drawings, which he didn't meet.
The client became more and more dissatisfied and gradually said so.
Utzon put it on the line that he would resign, probably expecting that his resignation wouldn't be accepted.
Which ultimately led to did he fall or was he pushed? He resigned, but with a hefty shove.
Utzon walking out on him, not only professionally but also personally, because he regarded Utzon as a friend, was pretty devastating for him.
Well, Mr. Arup, you've been back now long enough to have had a good look at the Opera House and to realise all the problems involved. How complex are they?
Well, how will you answer that question? They're as complex as you can imagine. I think that this must be about one of the most difficult jobs there are, architectural, to follow up on from Utzon on this. The fact is that the collaboration deteriorated to a degree where it simply stopped.
To build the planet's highest steeple is easier than to deal with people. Or people are a fickle lot. They do the things which they should not.
What he wanted to do was to be an engineer forging relationship with architects. And in a way, Sydney should have been the one that really crowned that ambition.
Ove was a dreamer, and Utzon was, I think, in his mind, the realization of that dream of what architecture could be or should be all about. And it wasn't to be.
When he came home from work, he always immediately went and sat down the piano. That was a sort of way of, you know, unwinding, relaxing and so on. He'd play for half an hour or so, just sort of, yes. That was very important to him.
And then suddenly, when it was opened, Wow.
If you had to pin down one building, say one building project that truly made them, it was Sydney Opera House.
It had a wow factor, you see. As a consequence of Sydney Opera House, by the 1980s, we were the first port of call of all the major architectural figures in this country. People like Foster and Rogers, Stirling.
I was in the lift with him on my own. And he said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Rich Goodfellow. I've been with you since 1941. He said, "Good Lord." He said, "Yes, yeah, I remember now." He said, "I don't know what sort of animal I was going to produce at that time." Because it was getting so large then, you know.
I meet so many people. I've got so much to do. So much is always going on. I don't know who is who.
He used to grumble the whole time about the firm getting too big because he couldn't quite equate that size with the possible lack of humanity in what we did and how we could coordinate and keep that uppermost in our minds.
This is one of the few things I took from old Arup. The idea that you should not have it too big, because otherwise by becoming too big you lose control. Not control in the sense of power. You lose that beautiful sensation to share and to enjoy the same emotion of discovery, of finding and looking, struggling and all that.
He was a watered bridge up in Durham between the university on the one side across the river to the town with the cathedral on the other side.
This was given to us on the distinct understanding that I myself should design it, which of course was very nice for me because then there was no argument about it. And we had plenty of time.
He was by that time quite well known to the architectural fraternity, and they thought he was half an architect. And in a way, he projected himself as half an architect and an engineer as well. And they didn't mind, they thought he was marvellous. And so this bridge had got to be good. And he was the designer of it. And it put him in a bit of a quandary, I think, because he was going to be judged by this bridge. So he didn't stop, and he didn't stop. The old man had endless ideas. He never stopped having ideas, but somebody had to turn them into a project. That was my job. I had to be able to catch the ideas as they came and then use them.
How strange that those who rejoice in the wisest possible choice are also the very kind who cannot make up their mind. Which is very nice.
And here one really ought to mention Yuzo Mikami. The old man, he thought, a number of problems I can't solve. There are little water spouts at 8-foot centres all along the bridge. and I don't know what shape to make them. All sorts of little things like that. And Yuzo would know the answer. So Yuzo joined us. I think the old man liked him because he was a perfectionist too.
I decided it was going to be very difficult to do a conventional bridge construction using formwork and all the rest of it. So he decided to do half the bridge parallel with the bank on each side. And when the two halves were completed, they were just rotated and connected in the middle. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, that was a totally novel and deeply thought solution to a problem.
One half was built before the other. And so they turned the first half, and they turned it with ropes, with men pulling on them. It was quite simple. And they locked it in position, and that was one half done.
Then the other side was to be turned, and because obviously big excitement as to whether or not they would actually meet in the middle. I went up with my father, we travelled up by train. It was a very sort of misty, grey, dull day.
One was like that, and the other was like that. I thought, that's good. But the last bit's going to be awful. And it fitted exactly. Oh, dear, oh dear.
And then he walked across the bridge there and then, as soon as the two parts had met.
In a way, I can say that this little bridge in Durham it has given me very great satisfaction because I had time and was given peace to work on it, for a long time. There was no hurry about it at all.
It was always, I think, a sadness of the old man. And he wasn't really allowed very often to do a project. The Durham Bridge was possibly the last UK project he ever did.
When Ove was about 75, people were realising that, he might die. Mortality was getting nearer by definition. And they told him to write down all his attitudes to instructions. And he refused because he said, I can't do it. But he was prevailed upon to make a speech called the Key Speech. And he wrote it and he spoke it. And obviously they grabbed it and reset it and tidied it up.
To deal fairly with the people inside and outside the firm.
He also said, how do you judge when you've done a good job? And he said, excellence has to be the objective.
To do good work, to aim for excellence.
Excellence. Not because it's not in the contract. It's not because the owner might say, look, I don't want that. Too bad. He gets it, right? And his third principle was we've got to make enough money to live. But he then tripped over it. He said, no, that's not an aim, that's a means. So it's somewhere an aim and a means. He tried to suppress money as other than, as one of the partners said, why do we want high salaries? To please our wives.
The trouble with money, a fact I deplore. Whenever you have it, you think you need more.
It's the finances are the third in the line, not the first. So Arup is not in business to make money first. Arup, the firm, is not in business to make money first. It's to do good work with good people, treated well, supported by a sound financial system. And what you can see is that if you adopt that approach, the firm can be financially, and has been, financially sound.
He wrote this extraordinary document. And it seems to have proved to be something which has helped to provide some, if not a lot of the glue, which is holding the firm together now.
And in a sense, we learned from them, and when we had to put our firm together, we brought the concept of a humanist organization together. We looked at their agendas, their speeches. There was a wonderful speech or paper written by Ove, I remember, a long time ago, which I think inspired me.
Even now, there are engineers in Europe, in a big organization, that still have that kind of philosophy, because there's a kind of DNA, I should say, that is left there. Maybe not everywhere, but in a number of people I know there, still now, there's something imprinted in there.
You know, we have this no ownership thing, which is very difficult to understand and to explain. All I know is that I was a partner in a firm where I had a share of the firm, and one day we all said that we would sell that ownership back to the firm for $1 or £1, whatever it was, i.e. nothing, and we would all become employees of ourselves, which is what happens in Arabs.
The partners, there were 6 at the time, they gave it away to a trust in 1977. The beneficiaries being the staff. But it was a single trust. In other words, you can't say, can I have my slice of cake? It's there forever. But while you're employed, you get the benefit of it. There's no owner.
In a way, it was a financial definition of the atmosphere that Ove had created.
It seems my energy has gone, and surplus time of that I've none. But if I'm lazy, I feel fine, so that must be my future line.
Towards the end, he got a bit tired. He had a big sofa. He would lie flat on the sofa and talk to me from the sofa. That was all right, we didn't mind.
He had a young mind, even though he was approaching 90 years of age. He was open to new ideas.
He enjoyed designing things. All his life, he designed things. He couldn't stop. In the end, he designed chess sets. He spent months designing these chess sets.
The very last time I saw him was just at Christmas, it must have been 87, because he came into the library and just as he was leaving, you know, he gave me a great big hug and wished me Happy Christmas in Danish. And that's the last time I really saw him.
Ove was ill, very ill, and he actually, his driver carried him downstairs, and he was sitting on his chair, which had wheels on it, and pushing himself around. And his mind started walking, going in and out of the clouds. He was 93. And unable ever not to face the truth. He's tried completely truthful. He looked at me and said, "Philip, this is farewell. And I think I must be one of the last in the firm to see him alive." And he's a very remarkable man. Wonderful man.
We all must die, but don't start hurrying, for that would set me really worrying. You have some chapters still to write, so don't give up without a fight. Then you will win, of that I'm certain. It's my turn next to take the curtain.
Part of the secret is that there was a great deal of informality. People didn't do something because the boss said so. All along, and we had a lot of very difficult people in the firm, and they all enjoyed being there because people listened to what they had to say.
As long as people feel that the top of a firm is accessible to anybody in that way, and you keep free ideas going, the sky's the limit.
Large numbers of people are cycling through Arups, joining, leaving, and so on. And yet the culture survives very strongly, even though there are so many new people coming all of the time.
I just hope that the original ethos of the firm continues. And of course it'll change because the firm's got bigger and projects are bigger. But it was a bit special, and I should like to think that it went on that way.
To his dying day, I think he felt himself to be a bit different. And he was, thankfully.
I've got lots of memories of him. I just think, someone to be very exciting to be around. And you can't say that about everybody.